Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Navis Nobilite. I am Captain Zelnick, and today we are going to be going over more deployment strategy. And when it comes to the Eldar, specifically the Craft World and Corsair Eldar, we are talking about a far more complex game than pretty much any of the other fleets. As mentioned in their videos that I've made on this channel, the Eldar break all the rules, especially in regards to movement. The Eldar do not really care about minimum distance. They don't care about facing. They don't care about turning. They don't really care about anything but themselves, which is proper and appropriate for Eldar. What really matters when it comes to playing as an Eldar player is recognizing how the sun affects your movement. Now, I've gone over this in other videos. I'm going to do a little bit more of a deep dive because it really matters in this case when it comes to initial deployment. Because what matters for the Eldar are number one, where the enemy is, number two, where the sun is, and number three, how am I approaching the destruction of my enemy. Eldar, because they don't play the same game as anyone else, have to modify their desire to win the game that doesn't that it can seem absolutely outlandish to pretty much any other race. So everything I said about, isolating fleets or the idea of the hangnail deployment and all of that, it kind of goes out the window because the Eldar, once again, are playing a very different game. Now, I will also be going into, in this video, things for the person who's playing against the Eldar player to consider while they are deploying themselves. Now, I'm going to be using this template here as an identifier for where the sun is. Now, as a reminder, Eldar's movement is dependent on where the sun is. Even in deep space, there is still theoretically a sun somewhere. Now, if the sun is on either of the short ends of the table, okay, it means, well, better way to describe it. If the sun is a beam to the Eldar ship, they're moving at their fastest. Think of it as a sailing vessel. If the wind is blowing into the sails the most, then they're going to go the fastest. Then, if it is behind them, it is going to go the second fastest. And then if it is in front of them, they're going to go the slowest. If you look at the actual movement ratings in their data cards, you're going to find that they have three different movement speeds, one for closing, one for moving away, and one for a beam. Now, as an Eldar player, your major maneuverability is to be determined by how much you can keep the sun in your beam arc. And this also means it determines where on the table you're actually able to access. So if the sun is right here, let's say the sun is coming off of this side of the table, you will not be accessing, unless you deploy in this area, this extreme edge of the table because you move so slowly towards it. Which means if you're over here, you're not accessing this whole end of the table. This side of the table is very hard to access if you are Eldar because the sun is blocking your path. For most ships, you're looking at maybe a total movement of 20 centimeters towards the sun. Now, that seems average for a lot of other fleets, but for the Eldar, that is cripplingly slow, and the ability to move quickly is very important. Now, what does that mean if the sun is, say, facing you? Well, it means instead of going super fast up and down the board, you will be traversing the table in zigzags, moving a beam to a beam, basically bouncing across the table as a little like a ping pong ball. And this is actually kind of ideal. You really do want the sun, if you can roll well, to either be in front or behind you as for the best and most amount of movement freedom. This way you can easily turn in and move a beam the fastest. And if you get at a good angle, you can still cross the table at pretty good speeds while also keeping your beam face towards the enemy. It doesn't apply to other Eldar players, or Necrons, but it does apply to literally everyone else. Now, if the sun is behind you, it's a little more advantageous, but you also run into other problems. You obviously move super fast, going a beam, and if you are, of course, if it's in the deployment zone you're in, it's much easier to claim a beam to the sun because, even that would, especially when you're playing with actual minis and not in Tabletop Simulator or in Vassal, you're going to find that it's much easier to claim in a beam status on more extreme angles if the sun is directly behind you. Now, the uh, the issue with having the sun directly behind you is that you are committed to crossing the board. You have to get from here to here, and there's really no way to go backwards very easily because once again, if you're trying to go get away from the enemy while by trying to go vertically across the table, you're running right into the sun. You very much have greater and greater limitations on oops wrong thing. You have greater and greater limitations on what and where you can go, and it is something that an Eldar player has to be prepared for. The sun can be very, very advantageous, but it can also be extraordinarily cruel. So, what about deployment? So, the most likely scenario is that the sun is going to be either in front of you or behind you, and if that's the case, really the where on the board you are doesn't matter that much because you can cross from end to end of the board extraordinarily fast. We're talking you're going to be traversing up to 60 centimeters, depending on the ship you're using, in a horizontal direction to the board. So you can play the game of completely confusing your opponent by placing your ships in seemingly nonsensical places. Because if you need to gather your ships back together as a single formation, it's very easy. If you want to separate them out and scatter them, it's very, very easy. So it matters far less. One thing to note, though, as you move across the table, if it's in front of you, it will be you're always going to be doing it in the most obscure and annoying way possible, which is going to make lining up those super critical lock-on shots very, very difficult. Now, the same thing goes with the sun if it's behind you. You're really unhindered by the presence of the sun because again, all of the movement is now in your favor. Going straight across is decent speed, and going zigzagging is at hyper speed. So that's great, and it's much easier to line up those perfect lock-on shots. However, you're not coming back. It is very hard to travel towards the sun. Now, the real trick of deployment for the Eldar is when the sun is on the short end of the table. Because a lot of what you're going to be doing, at least for the most part, there are other factors that I'll get into. You're going to find yourself deploying as close to that sunward edge as you can to maximize your movement. The maximum amount of distance that you can travel is extraordinarily important because while you can go back and forth very easily, you have less room to go. And while you can go back towards the sun, it's much harder. And you want to avoid having your opponent boxing you into a corner right up against the sun. Because either you have to run the gauntlet through their lines, or you're going to get crushed up against the table edge while the enemy proceeds to beat you like the knife ear that you are. So bear that in mind. Now, the next thing that can affect your deployment is stellar phenomena. So I'm going to actually go over here and get two of the most common stellar phenomena. Pull it on the table, give it a dice roll. Okay, that's good enough. And some asteroids. So, well, good, and a small planet, which are the most common ones. Okay, so we have three pieces of terrain here that are the three most common forms of terrain that you are going to be encountering. Asteroid fields, gas clouds, and planets. Now, deployment for Eldar in regards to these three pieces of terrain is extraordinarily important because these are going to change how you play the game. If there is no terrain on the table, let's say you roll no terrain in a mercurial zone, and all you get is solar flares and radiation bursts, or and for really any other form of play that has an empty board, really your only deployment factor is the sun. And you're also going to have a hard time because you can't hide anywhere. Adding in the terrain features like planets, like asteroid fields, and like gas clouds changes everything. First things first, for the gas cloud, you want to avoid this at all costs. Or should I say, you want to avoid traveling through it at all costs. As per the rules, gas clouds are giant blast markers. Well, what happens to an Eldar when they traverse a gas cloud? Well, guess what? You roll to see if you take damage, because evidently, stellar hydrogen can be terribly damaging to ships made out of tissue paper. Now, that does not mean they are not useful. They are, because being shot through a gas cloud is stacking with your hollow fields, which means that's a negative shift, and then the hollow fields is a negative shift, or two right shifts for the rules specific, which can turn a closing shot into a beam shot, which really matters. But you have to navigate them without traveling through them. So gas clouds are very much a two-edged sword. Now, asteroid fields are your best friends because you can go into an asteroid field, park in that asteroid field, and not move, which means until you have an advantageous shot. You only roll for asteroids if you move in them. If you don't move, you're not doing anything. And Eldar don't need to move. They have a minimum speed of 0. So if you want, you just move your, especially escorts. Escorts are best at this. Move a squadron of Hemlocks, Hellbores, not Nightshades really, or Aconites into the. Well, you could do it with Nightshades, and basically, if you have torpedoes, you have to be a little more careful. But that's only because you need to properly line up the torpedo salvo so everyone is out of the asteroid field, or you're either firing less or you're just not firing at all. But just park them in an asteroid field and wait for the opportune strike. The enemy has to come to you, which means you will have an opportunity to line up a lock on and cause absolute havoc and then jump back into the asteroid field. You can do this with cruisers. I've done it with Void Stalkers. Asteroid fields are your best friend because they block incoming enemy line of sight. Planets are kind of in between. Planets are a big help because if you do it right, you can lock on, move, and then use the gravitational pull of that moon or planet to help you turn, which means you can get a turn, not just at the beginning of your turning, but a 45-degree turn after you move, which is kind of a no-no for the Eldar, broadly speaking. So it gives you a great deal more flexibility, but you only get the benefits of being having the line of sight blocked if you are fully outside the planet template, which is very important because if you're sitting on the planet, you can still be shot, and you don't have the benefit of any kind of negative column shift that you would suffer while being inside of an asteroid field or on the other side of a gas cloud. So really big planets are very hard to use as line of sight blockers because you need to be able to move on them, have the range to shoot off them, and the ability to fire ordnance if you can, because planets block torpedoes, and then move back to the other side. Small planets are great for this, but because they're small, their template doesn't always save you. So that's something to bear in mind. So when you're doing your deployment, where these useful or hazardous forms of terrain are is very, very important because you're going to want to be as close to this asteroid field in deployment as you can. So if I were a Eldar, even with a Void Stalker, with deployment, I would be right there because my goal is to go right into that asteroid field and stay there until I have an advantageous position. For planets, again, considering where the enemy may be, I want to be on the opposite side of this moon. That way I can block things like Nova cannons or 60-centimeter weapons batteries or anything that can cause me trouble. Gas clouds, if it is a table covered in gas clouds, there's nothing wrong with kind of chilling on one side of a gas cloud, just making tiny little movements here and there. While the enemy moves closer and their firepower is reduced significantly. But don't rely on this. Even one shot with a long-range weapons battery can ruin your day and can completely undermine your ability to fight. Remember, all it takes is one shot to cause severe problems for even a Void Stalker. You hit on fours, they crit on fours, and trust me, as somebody who has dealt with bulkhead collapses on one single long-range shots, you can't rely on the gas cloud. It is there as a tactical factor and not a tactical linchpin. Now, warp rifts. Warp rifts block line of sight. Navigating them is extraordinarily dangerous. Now, Eldar have better leadership than most. That doesn't mean that they can navigate a warp rift. I just had a game with Tyrus where I tried to be cheeky, throw a leadership 10 squadron of Hemlocks into a warp rift to try and teleport behind his tomb ship, and they were lost because I rolled horribly. As with all things, warp rifts are a tactical risk. Huge risks, huge rewards. Now, as an Eldar player, you really don't need that kind of navigation and that kind of advantage. But they can be very useful for blocking line of sight. They're just extraordinarily dangerous. Now, um, based upon that, the final factor for Eldar deployment is crucial factors in your enemy's fleet. So if you are facing up against an enemy fleet that has super long range firepower, that is going to be your priority for destruction. So overlords, retribution battleships, anything with 60 centimeter range weapons, or even up to 45, depending on the fleet, are going to be your priority targets, which means you should focus your deployment strategy around that. Either through avoidance, which is ultimately impossible because at 60 centimeters, they're eventually going to crowd you out. Your goal should not be to avoid it if you can. It should be mitigation until you can destroy it. Emperors, retributions, oberons, any battleship or any battle cruiser or heavy cruiser or any ship that can reach to 60 centimeters must be a priority for destruction. Okay? Which means you need to have a plan while deployment is happening to have proper coverage to destroy it. All right? That means utilizing your terrain if you can. That means utilizing the sun if you can. And that means prioritizing the destruction of the enemy while protecting your ships. This seems very complex, and it is. Now, that means that you have to know your enemy, know how they function, know how they fight, and know your opponent and their tendencies. So you'll have to do a lot of baiting and switching, having a ship that seems like it's supremely valuable when in reality the risk is somewhere else. You have to uh, force your enemy to make bad decisions, which is one of the most common tactics that the Eldar do, which is I have two bad choices, I can only really deal with one of them. So if an enemy has a pair of overlords, they have to die. The question is, how am I going to kill them? Well, a lot of it's going to be remembering that the enemy must move towards you. So that means keeping your enemy in a position where there is something blocking their line of sight. Or, if it's the case of the overlords, staying in arcs that they can't shoot you with. Or at least they can't shoot well at you with. When it comes to ships that can shoot with good firepower all around, like the Emperor, that's a bit harder of a problem. You need to find some other way of shutting them down, or at the very least, causing situations and problems for them where they can't prioritize their fire well. If you're playing Craft World Eldar, a really good way of doing it is dumping Aspect Warrior filled vampire hunters into their ships and disabling their weapons. Or it's dumping out a bunch of torpedoes, fighter, and bombers in ways that the thing can't necessarily prioritize you over them. Yes, your bombers are not going to do particularly well, but it may force them to shoot them with the batteries or not, and you may be able to get in if you have fighter coverage to cause damage from further away, at least for a couple of rounds. So recognize, though, that if you're on a terrainless board or a board with only gas clouds, as an Eldar player, you're not walking away from the battle without a black eye. Just remember, you are faster than them, you are more maneuverable than them, and you hit much harder than them. If the battle ultimately comes down to I am killing your emperor and that's it, I don't care how many more ships I lose, then that's the battle. Uh, you're the trick of it is making sure that you're good on your braces, making sure that the enemy has to focus on one thing and one thing only, otherwise they'll suffer while everything else gets into position to fire, or it's basically spraying and praying because you don't have any other options. Because in reality, Eldar are a very difficult fleet to fly. Now, moving on to everybody else against the Eldar. Remember that the Eldar have points sinks that are enormous. The Hellbore is a very expensive escort. If somebody's bringing a squad of 6 of those things, it doesn't matter what else they're bringing. The real risk are those Hellbores, because quite frankly, one good lock-on round with a Hellbore and you're destroying anything you're shooting. The Voidstalker is a very expensive battleship because it's not 380 points, it's 480 points because you must take a Pirate Lord on top of it. At least I think you can. Regardless, I may be wrong on that rule. I think the Pirate Lord has to be on the largest ship. Even if not, if they're taking a Voidstalker, it's 380 points for a 10 hit, 4 up armor, 4 to crit battleship. Yeah, it's got great range and amazing firepower, but all it takes is one bad hit and the entire thing crumples like a tin can, which means as a Imperial, Chaos, Orc, anyone else, any other player, my priority is finding the most expensive thing on the board, punching it as hard as I can until it either runs away or it breaks. Because if the Eldar player loses their hammer, if they lose the weight of their points, they are losing an incredible amount of firepower. The firepower that is vested in Hellbores is enormous. The firepower vested in a Voidstalker is enormous. The firepower vested in Eclipse, even the Shadow, the Auroras, everything is very, very expensive. Okay? Which means you're going to outnumber them, and you have tools to kill them. So I'm not telling you to tailor your list. I try to avoid tailoring my list, but nobody will argue that you are tailoring your list if you take a squad of 6 swords. They're the most common and most efficient escort for the Imperial Navy. You should always take them if you have the points for them. But swords will absolutely slaughter the Eldar. Okay? Tyrants will do terrible things to the Eldar. A lot of these ships that are very common, remember that you should have a good, broad spectrum of shots. Find where the most expensive thing is, hunt it down relentlessly, and kill it. Is the enemy hiding in an asteroid field? Fine, go into the asteroid field and flush him out. You can go into asteroid fields too. Yes, it's dangerous. Not nearly as dangerous as letting whatever's sitting in that asteroid field to continue what it's doing. And crucially, to all of my Imperial and really any other player, remember that your escorts re-roll their leadership when they go into an asteroid field. Okay? If you fail once, you roll again, you're going to be okay. Most likely. Go in, punch him in the face in his own game, and force him up against the table edge, which means your deployment should be as close to the sunward edge as you can make it, because it's going to make him have a horrible time getting to basically it's going to make him have a terrible time getting to you, because all of the range of his weapons except for the Voidstalker is 30 centimeters, which is advantageous for you. Now remember, the sun, if it's on either side, which means if it's on either side, put your fleet. Oops, let me deselect that Eldar. Okay. If your sun's over here, your fleet should be over here. If the sun is over here, come on. Sun's over here, your fleet should be over here. Okay? If the sun is behind you, sit your happy ass along this board edge and make him take forever to get to you. Watch where his motions go and figure out what's expensive and go and kill it. The only time you're going to have a harder issue with that is if the sun is behind you, but that means you should be racing towards him as quickly as you can, because at least in that scenario, you're taking away his maneuvering options. Okay? He will have to cross the gauntlet. He will have to pass by you at some point. And in that moment, you have the greatest opportunity to destroy him. So that's Eldar and deployment. I hope all of you find this useful. If it was really complicated, I'll try to explain it on live stream sometime. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all again in the next video. Bye-bye.